Okay, can you still see what I'm showing and not my face, hopefully?
Completely, yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to start by, oops, let me just go on to the next. Why isn't this working? Come on. There we go. So yeah, just a little bit of background on me. So my name's Amir Alexander Salem. My pronouns are he, him. A short excerpt of who I am. Well, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher and project manager based between London and Berlin. I was born in London and raised between there and Cairo, Egypt, and my research spans LGBTQ plus communities and nightlife spaces in the city, so cultural policy and nighttime governance. So a little bit about my education. I'm currently doing my MSc studies at UCL, and I'm due to finish hopefully at the end of this summer. Beginning of the autumn, and I was previously at King's doing a geography degree, and professionally I'm a project manager and a researcher and a writer at nighttime consultancy called Vibe Lab, which is based between Berlin, Sydney and Amsterdam. And yeah, I guess let's just get straight into it, because this was really part of my undergraduate research when I was at King's, and I was really interested in London's queer spaces. So I want to begin by painting a picture about contemporary British society. So in 2018, Stonewall found that British LGBTQ plus people are disproportionately more likely to have experienced an identity-related hate crime incident in comparison to their heterosexual counterparts. Even more alarmingly, when we look at the Risk and Resilience report, in 2015, this report investigated mental health amongst British youth and found that 34% of lesbian, gay and bisexual youth had attempted suicide at least once in their lives, in comparison to 18% of heterosexual youth. I think even more alarmingly, the report emphasised that almost half of Britain's trans and gender non-conforming youth had attempted suicide, in comparison to a quarter of Britain's cisgender youth. So really, it's in this context that I'd like to ask this really pressing question that gets me very emotional every time. Maybe you can hear it in the quiver of my voice, but why are queer spaces, nightlife spaces important? So obviously, I think it's important to note here that nightlife spaces that cater to queer folks mean different things to different communities. They play a significant role in the grounding of contemporary queer cultures, both historically and today, and they serve as safer, and I note safer spaces from the cis heteronormative world that we live in. So taking this into consideration, I've come up with some ideas to maybe spur your mind. So it's a little word cloud. So like I said, I get emotional thinking about this because I think beyond kind of consumption, they facilitate so many more things. They're a space of visibility, but also invisibility, if you like. It's a space for intergenerational exchange, dialogue, innovation, safety, therapy, joy, everything. I mean, it's so crucial, I think, for queer folks that really rally around nightlife in particular. This is the kind of space, the kind of social infrastructure that is really important to us. And also, I think it's really, really important to underscore, if you do a little bit of groundwork, you'll see that Black and brown queer communities have historically and continue to be central to the cultural production of music genres that we all consume and enjoy today. And I turn your attention to a 2014 resident advisor think piece called An Alternate History of Sexuality and Club Culture by Luis Manuel Garcia. You can follow that in the links at the very end. And precisely in this context then, I wanted to look at London's queer spaces. So despite London's global reputation of having kind of a vast diversity of nightlife spaces that cater to different communities, UCL Laboratory reported a net loss of 58% of London's licensed, and I say licensed, LGBTQ plus venues between 2006 and 2017. Yeah, so I think if you look at this map here, 2006, 2018, I think it shows quite poignantly how many venues have been lost in the space of 10 years. Bearing in mind, yeah, this was 2017 when I was how old was I? I was 21 when I was doing this research. And I don't know what the kind of the map would look like today. And back in 2017, the intensity of closures to many long-standing venues had garnered the attention of the media, and there was many speculations in these kind of journalistic accounts as to why spaces were closing. So if you look here, you can see just a plethora, a taster of some of the reasons that, that were believed to be the reasons why spaces were closing. So it was really in conjunction with previous academic literature. My research drew directly from these journalistic accounts and informed my research questions. So my study centered around three fundamental research questions, analyzing how A, gentrification, B, LGBTQ+ dating apps and online meeting spaces, and C, changing habits and attitudes are impacting London's queer nightlife spaces. More widely, I wanted to investigate if these factors were driving the decline, and if so, how, of course. So moving on to my research design, I think given the nature of my study, I favored an intensive qualitative approach to investigating these three research questions. And I conducted 14 in-depth semi-structured interviews with two distinct interviewee groups. The first being London's queer venue managers and event organizers, and the second one being notable figureheads of London's queer communities, including artists, performers, activists, and of course, queer nightlife goers, so folks from the community themselves. And I think taking, again, another step back, we should reflect here that this, and underscore here that this research is truly only representative of the folks that obviously consented to taking part in these interviews that I conducted. And there's so much more literature out there really nowadays to really spell out these questions that I have in mind. But back then, just to note, there weren't really any questions. It was kind of the same time that UCL laboratory was doing their research that I was asking these questions as well. So that's why they align somewhat closely with UCL laboratory's report. So moving on to the findings, I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight now as to how gentrification, so socioeconomic drivers, were impacting queer venues. So venue managers in Lambeth, Westminster and Hackney emphasised how increasing rents pose a growing threat to their businesses and also the long-term prospect of remaining open to clientele. And also venue managers in Lambeth, Westminster, Hackney further noted that little or no support was offered from local authorities specifically to support their business. This could be in the form of, say, soundproofing in response to noise complaints issued against their venues from nearby gentrifying residents. Both venue managers, event organisers and Hackney condemned how easy it is to get a venue shut down, noting that local authorities gave these new gentrifying developments the upper hand. Lastly, community figureheads and venue managers I spoke to in Westminster and Hackney expressed that social tensions were mounting between their businesses and new gentrifying, mostly heterosexual businesses in each borough respectively. So just again, another kind of caveat, I think, well, it's all well and good that I can point that gentrification might be one of the driving factors leading to the decline of queer spaces. It's also important to note that queer spaces have also been complicit in certain parts of London's gentrification. So again, and just another kind of caveat to remember when we're looking at the nuances of gentrification, how it impacts nightlife in the city. So thinking about how I could display qualitative research, which is obviously quite hard, and I don't want to make you all read quotes from the interviewees, but I've created these interactive maps where you can literally play and listen back to my voice, so that we've anonymized the interviewees, and you can listen to some of the excerpts and some of the qualitative data that would help back up this claim, I guess. Moving on to the technological drivers, so the socio-technological drivers, looking at apps and the rise of kind of online meeting spaces. My research suggests that dating apps are increasingly being mediated to create new meeting spaces beyond the kind of physical settings of queer nightlife venues and gay bars. So venue managers in Westminster suggested that dating apps have increasingly changed or have changed the kind of viability or the necessity to congregate in their venues respectively. So there's something about the kind of use of venues. I think maybe historically venues would have been used as literal meeting spaces because that was like the only space you could meet another person maybe like yourself. And apps kind of pose an interesting, what do you call it, like an impact, quite interestingly, I think, around usage. And again, certain cisgender gay male interviewees noted that they found mediating the internet to be easier than navigating queer venues themselves. And they were using apps, for instance, like the geolocation-based dating app, which is called Grindr. I'm sure some of us might be aware of this app, or many of us. And they were using this for specific social uses. Again, I invite you to look at these interviewee excerpts. And then moving on to the last kind of pillar of my research, looking at the socio-cultural drivers. I think it's important again to note that this is a very subjective question. So how are changing attitudes and habits within and also towards queer communities impacting the venues? So I think the most interesting thing that came out of this was that certain community members noted that they have found new queer parties to attend beyond the kind of confines of the homonormative gay neighborhood. So maybe neighborhoods like Soho in this case, suggesting that there are new parties taking place in kind of ad hoc, sporadic venues. And yeah, these are kind of nightlife events that don't take place in the same venue every day or every week, sorry. And I think, yeah, taking another step back, I think this shows for researchers trying to kind of discern the shifting spatial patterns and the spatiality of queer nightlife in London, that this can become a bit of a slippery slope. So really this moves, again, here's the kind of interview excerpt, sorry. This moves to a question that I have been asking myself for a while now. So if London's licensed queer cultural infrastructure is in decline, then where is next for queer nightlife in the city? And that really moves on to my current research, which I'm about to engage with, which is looking at London's queer nightlife collective. So in the last kind of, let's say like 5 to 10 years, there's been a growing plethora of different parties and queer nightlife collectives kind of effing up nightlife, if you like. And changing the scene completely. And it raises so many timely questions, I think, now after the pandemic, about, you know, how do these queer collectives negotiate how they go about creating these safer spaces in the kind of confines of cis heteronormative venues, right? That's the big question for me that I'm really dying to answer. I think it also raises some fundamental questions around nighttime governance, and as well, like venue ownership. Is the end goal for these queer collectives to like own a venue, or is it, I don't know, what does that look like in the queer collective's eyes? Yeah, so that's really where I'm at to, yeah, question and answer. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. Ooh, that's not gonna positionality statement.
Thank you, Alex. That was
a very quick whistle-stop tour of my previous research, but I hope it raises some questions. And yeah, I will share my contact details as well in the chat.
For sure. I already have some questions, but I think so that we make sure that we have enough time for everyone. I think it's better if we just, also there might be things that kind of overlap, or questions that apply, for example, to both presentations about London. So I think it might be more productive, but please don't forget about the questions if any popped your mind, and you can already type them in the chat. So we ask them by the respective order at the end.
Thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you for your really important presentation, actually. And I would like to move on to Stuart now, which means Leeds in terms of geography.
Sorry, I'm just typing the question for Alex.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Turn on that, right? It's just I just typing as I was thinking, so I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to we'll come back to questions afterwards. But I'll just find my correct screen to share, and screen 1 is there. So can you see my screen? Please tell me that you can.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Right. Okay. So hello, everybody, and it's a pleasure to talk to you all. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something which I call Leeds Club History Project. It's not the most exciting title, but it does what it says. So I think it's fairly accurate. And this is something to do with my PhD, which I'll explain to you throughout the presentation. And it's kind of an output from the PhD, which is also it's become one of the ways by which I'm recording data, which I'm collecting for my PhD. So I'll give you context, and I'll explain everything within the presentation. So I'll just go to the next slide. Okay, so in short, I'm going to introduce myself and my background, introduce the city of Leeds as the location of my research, explain my PhD research methods and themes, and then discuss the project as an output from the PhD and where I feel that that's going to go in future. So without further ado, so all about me. So I am the archetypal definition of what an old raver looks like. So I was born in the early 1970s, and when the second Summer of Love kicked in 1988, I was 16 years old. And by 1991, I was firmly entrenched in what was an unofficial party scene in various cities and countryside locations around northern England. I had a really good time, and from that I decided that I needed to do something with my life other than dance in a field. So I went traveling and I ended up working for Vodafone in Australia, of all things, and eventually settled back in the UK in the late 90s, and ended up in Leeds and became an undergraduate student as a mature student in 1997. I graduated in 2001, and I started teaching in 2002, and I've never looked back, really. So I've been a senior lecturer for 21 years. I worked, like I said, I was a mature student, so I had the life experience before I went to university, and now I'm kind of I'm reminiscing now about a lot of aspects of my life in the research that I'm doing, because it provides a good basis for autoethnography. I'm hugely into music. Career-wise, hotels, events, technology, telecoms. I've had 5 books published, mostly around entertainment and employability itself, which was an academic area which I've specialised within. And then I've got lots of book chapters and other bits and pieces like that. And I decided to do a PhD very late, just a few years ago, and I'm currently in the final year of writing it up. I was in 2 minds as to whether to do a PhD, but I decided I would do. I just fancied being Dr. Moss, to be quite honest. And then other things I do, I'm a filmmaker, traveller, home brewer, serial creative. I just like making things, basically. I'm always busy. That's me. And if you want to read a little bit more about what I do, then there's a website at the bottom. So that's about me, just to introduce who I am. So Leeds, I want to talk about Leeds to begin with now, because Leeds is a city which suffers from an image problem, because we're not famous like Liverpool and Manchester, because we didn't have the Beatles and we don't have Manchester United, yet we're a competing city in the north of England. So Leeds is a city which is kind of an underdog in image, but not in terms of what it's got. We've got a population of over 800,000 people within the city itself, and the wider region, which is called Leeds City Region, has over 3 million people. We're extremely multicultural. We've got substantial populations from the Afro-Caribbean community throughout Asia, particularly India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. We've got a large Eastern European population as well. We're a big mixing pot of a country. And my Zoom has just gone off the screen. Has it gone off everybody else's, or am I still talking to you?
We still see and hear.
Okay, sorry, the Zoom has just completely disappeared off my screen. That just made me panic for a second. Okay, I'll carry on then. So Leeds itself is an ex-industrial city. It was built on textiles and then coal mining and chemicals, and now all of that has gone. And now it's a financial and a service city. So most, we've got a lot of banking. We have broadcasting. Channel 4 have got a new headquarters there. The Conservative Party are opening a second headquarters in Leeds. So we're recognised as being quite an influential city. We've got 5 higher education institutions: the University of Leeds, Leeds Beckett University, Leeds Trinity University, Leeds Conservatoire, and Leeds Arts University. We've got numerous smaller colleges, and there are over 80,000 people in education aged over 16 plus within the city, which, if you think about 80,000 out of 800,000, that's 10% of people in the city are in education and youngsters. So we're a young city. We're a city which has always had a reputation for being a young city, and that has attracted people to come to Leeds, because when you're a young city, then you have nightlife to cater for that young city. It's supply and demand. We're well accessible, intercity rail links all over the country. We've got our own international airport, but a little bit of trivia for you here. We are the largest city in Europe not to have a tram or light rail-based metro system, so everybody relies on buses, basically. Very congested roads. And in terms of popular culture, so things which Leeds should be more famous for, possibly, is the fact that the first ever moving image was filmed in Leeds by a Belgian called Louis Laprance. Then we've got Leeds United Football Club, which, when I'm working in Europe and I say, has anybody heard of Leeds? One person will put their hand up and say Leeds United. Then we've got a professional rugby team, Leeds Rhinos. Leeds Festival is a major international festival which takes place each year. It's the sister festival to the Reading Festival. Leeds West Indian Carnival is the oldest West Indian carnival in the world outside of the West Indies. Not the largest, but the oldest. And then in terms of musicians, the Kaiser Chiefs, the Utah Saints, the Sisters of Mercy, basically goth was invented in Leeds. And it's got a great reputation for nightlife, and nightlife is where lots of these things like goth, for example, started. DIY post-punk fans combining with new romantics created a new movement which retrospectively became known as goth. That came out of the nightlife of Leeds in the 1980s, and goth is now global. It's a phenomenon. So that's just kind of introducing a little bit about Leeds itself, and I will go on to my next slide. So my PhD is called "You Can't Spell Leeds Without LSD and a Couple of E's." It's about the story of the promotion and development of club venues as leisure spaces in Leeds from 1990 to 2020. So I remember back in the olden days when I was of the rave scene ilk, that saying, "You can't spell Leeds without LSD and a couple of E's," was quite commonplace within the city. A lot of people used to say it, very tongue-in-cheek and joking. And these days, people of my age know that saying. The young people, to them, it's like a hilarious joke because they can't believe that they've never thought to say it themselves. So I'm picking up where the illegal rave scene kind of left off. Although I'm going back a couple of years before then. So I'm sort of looking at a time frame primarily from 1990 to 2020. So an era when there was a huge amount of demand to dance predominantly to electronic music and to take the drugs that went with that, which in those early days was mostly ecstasy and some acid as well. But that's obviously changed and developed through the years as the music has changed, the drugs have changed, the scenes have changed, normative behaviour in venues has changed, etc. So in the early days, the rave scene went inside to nightclubs, and a lot of the behaviours of drug taking and fashions and so forth went with them. And then nightclubs became they got a bad reputation in the eyes of the law and the authorities. So there were clampdowns and CCTV and everything else that happens within the venues to basically control and police the behaviour. So that, eventually those rave behaviours were stamped out, rave fashions were discouraged, drug taking was massively more discouraged, and there were clampdowns on that. And what we ended up with was a super club industry in Leeds. where we had lots of large venues, large-scale venues with multiple rooms competing against each other, and we had a plethora of nightlife venues as a result of that. This attracted a lot of people to the city to study at university. A lot of those people came to university, got part-time jobs within the industries themselves. They were either flyering or helping to promote, or they were working in venues. They had a taste of it. They wanted to create their own thing. So it was kind of like people were learning on the job and becoming promoters, and then starting their own nights and their own events and so on. So that's what has happened within Leeds. So what I'm trying to do is piece together a narrative analysis from interviews with independent club event promoters. And I've had 15 long interviews of between 45 minutes and 90 minutes, where I've basically sat down and we've had really long chats about, you know, the olden days and so forth, and really rich data has come out of that. I've also done shorter interviews with a number of other promoters who don't have the time to chat with me as much, but I'm trying to build up a picture of who did what and when. Why did you do it? What influenced you? Who influenced you? I'm also looking, the internet's a wonderful resource, all the Facebook groups, all the groups about memories of venues which have now long gone, venues which I've never even heard of sometimes. I'm looking at content analysis of news articles, social media and event promotional materials. And then I'm using my own experiences and memories from the perspective of an attendee and a promoter. And eventually I ended up working in event security in the late 90s when I was a student, just to supplement my student income, basically. So that's like a framework of my PhD. The key themes that I'm looking at are the business of operating venues. So I'm looking at the micro and macro environmental forces which have shaped and influenced the development of nightlife in Leeds, alongside established business strategic tools, competitor mapping, Steeple, Porter's 5 Forces, Schumpeter's creative destruction cycle, and so forth. I'm looking at marketing and promotion. I'm looking at how that has changed and developed over the years, from what was basically hand-drawn flyers in the early days to what we have today with social media and everything else, and all the things which have gone on in between. I'm looking at themes related to enterprise and serious leisure on behalf of the promoters, because a lot of these people were, for example, the bedroom DJ that then got an opportunity to play at an event, that realized he could run his own event or her own event, and then they create their own spaces. So there's serious leisure comes into this. I'm looking at youth cultures, leisure spaces, safe spaces for marginalized community, class, dancing, fashion rules, normative behavior, and drugs, lots of drugs. It's basically a huge jigsaw which I'm throwing together, which includes all of these different areas. I'm looking at the rise to prominence of electronic dance music in Leeds from the early 1980s to present. And then I'm looking at the evolution of venues for dancing in Leeds in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm beginning where it all started, which was ballrooms, which became dance halls, which became discos and nightclubs. Then we had the unlicensed rave period. Then we had the clubs of the 90s. Then we had licensed industrial venues, so warehouses that become licensed and operate as clubs. And then what we've seen in the past sort of a massive re-emergence in the past sort of 5 or 6 years, which has been hugely buoyed by COVID, is house parties, which is where the new rave scene is now happens, where you know the kids can take as many balloons as they want with them, because you know a balloon is very conspicuous in a club. Nobody cares at a house party, and so you know the music changes, the drugs change, and so forth. And the rave scene is now, you know, it's happening every single weekend in Leeds, all around the student suburbs near the universities. So Leeds Club History Project stems from all of this, and what I'm attempting to do is map the development of recurring branded club events in Leeds. So I'm looking at mainly branded events, you know, when events started to be given actual names, because there was a period where if it was a heavy metal night, it would be called a rock night, and that would be it. It wouldn't have a name. You know, it wasn't until the late 1980s, early 1990s that we started to really see en masse branded names used in place of the actual name of the club. Like instead of saying Wednesday night at this venue, it suddenly had a name like Star or Stomp or something like that. So I'm talking to people, I'm using all the resources I can find online, and I've created a very large event spreadsheet, and I'm hoping that that is going to play through the Zoom link. Can you see the webpage now for Leeds Club History Project, or is it still on the PowerPoint?
We can see the page. Thank
Wonderful. You. Right, so this is just the project website. It's just one page just to sort of introduce what it is. And people can submit a Leeds Club event to the project if they want to, if they wish to submit one for themselves. And the list of events that I've gathered so far can be seen by clicking there. And what that list of events currently looks like is this. And at present, it's currently about nearly 1,200 rows on a Google form at the minute. And what I'm just showing you this in age order at the minute. I usually sort it by alphabetical order of event name because it's easier, but I decided to just do this in age order just to show you that where club events started in Leeds was actually in 1943, a one-off event by a notorious criminal, unfortunately, but you can't change history. And that, that was the first event just there in 1943. And then there are other venues that ran events that were unnamed events quite often. And then as we go through time, we can see in the 1970s, we start to see, oh, there we go, F Club, Stars of Today, Fan Club, Rock Against Racism, things like that start to emerge. We start to see the names of the promoters that were involved in this, who were the DJs, what was the music that was taking place, where were the venues. And we can see, the rise of punk in the 1970s, and punk and reggae combination towards the end of the 1970s, and then the beginnings of goth, alternative indie rock, punk, oi, psychobilly, etc. We see hip hop beginning in 1985, and then house music, hip hop and house music, all in 1986. So, and then from 1986 onwards, house becomes one of the predominant music genres and all the subgenres of house, etc. And I could scroll through this entire sheet and talk at length, but I don't have that time to do that with you. But if you want to find this sheet and have a look at the approach I've taken, it is www.leedschp.co.uk, and there is the link within there to that. So I'll just go back to my PowerPoint. So the idea of the spreadsheet really is for me to create something with that data, which is visual. I will be creating graphs over time of venues, of promoters, of genres, and I'll be overlaying these to sort of try and visually represent what happened. I really liked Alex's geographical map, and that's also a consideration. And there's another archive which is called Mdma, Manchester Digital Music Archive, which I've looked at, which is also a similar sort of thing as well. And I really like that idea of the visual sort of geographical element to it, because we've gone from having venues which were spread all around the city to having venues that were only in the city centre, to now having venues which are no longer in the city centre but spread around the city centre. And it's interesting to see how that has happened, that sort of out, then in, and then back out again, and which is where we are right now. So beyond the PhD, I will be writing a book about all of this, and I'm probably going to look at some kind of multimedia online presence, either a podcast, which will be a lot to do with the interviews that I've done, or some kind of film series, or something else. I'm not quite sure yet. But I know I've gone over my 15 minutes, so thank you for listening to me. I know I talk at 100 miles an hour, but I have a lot to say. And if you want to get in contact with me, then there's details on there. But I'll hang around for questions. I need to leave about 3:30ish because I'm going to a book launch, which I'm working at. But thank you, everybody, for listening to me. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was really insightful. And because you have to leave, then I will maybe open the floor if someone wants to ask you a question before you have to leave.
Yeah, I mean, Miguel, can I ask to Stuart a question?
Of course.
It's not a question, but a comment. Because I would love to read your PhD thesis, Stuart. So please finish right now your PhD thesis. And yeah, because you are like shedding light on the collective memory of the nightlife in Leeds. And I think that what I see is that you are collecting so much material about the nightlife in Leeds, or the history of nightlife, history and present of nightlife in Leeds, that maybe you can sell it to the city council. I mean, the city council could think about becoming a kind of little Berlin. I mean, like a new capital of electronic music dance clubbing, for example, emphasizing the heritage of the past year and present, of course. I mean, your PhD thesis has a lot of potential to highlight the importance not only of clubbing itself, like a time space for meeting people and dancing and so on, but to emphasize the social and cultural history and present of the city. I mean, for me, I don't know Leeds. I mean, I only know London, but I would love to go there and know the nightlife in Leeds. I mean, it's amazing. So for me, it's like a little Berlin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
I appreciate your comment. So it's interesting what you said about the council, because in the early 1990s, the council were fully behind the promoters because they saw the economic benefits of the knock-on effect of people coming to Leeds as music tourists to visit venues. And the council actually started to call Leeds a 24-hour city about 10 years before it was legal for venues to open 24 hours. And they got round the rules by allowing venues to play music for 23 hours, but nobody actually did play music for 23 hours, but they could not sell alcohol after 2 a.m. until 11 a.m. the next day. So what it meant was that people would arrive at the venue for maybe 10 o'clock in the evening, and they would stay until 4, 5 o'clock the next evening, but there's no alcohol after 2. So then you have to imagine, what do people do if they can't take alcohol? Well, of course.
Of course.
So this happened. This was 1990s Leeds, and unfortunately, in a lot of the issues which Alex has raised about rents and corporatization of spaces, people building residential complexes in city centres, all these kinds have impacted on the nightlife. And the council is unfortunately not on the side of the nightlife anymore. It used to be. It used the nightlife to enhance its reputation, but now it's more on the side of corporate Leeds, and it's happy to see venues pushed out of the city centre. Yeah, which is a shame, but that seems to be where we're going. But in terms of the culture thing that you mentioned, next year Leeds is celebrating a year of culture, 2023, and I am trying to wedge my way into that somehow with something from the project. So watch this space on that.
It will be great. Thank you.
We have another question from Guilherme. He's asking, apart from thanking for the presentation, what is the connection between the industrial past of the city and maybe the current creative nightlife in the city? I think of Detroit immediately. I don't know if I'm the only one.
So, I mean, if we look back at when Leeds ceased to become an heavy industrial city in the 1980s. So Mrs. Thatcher closed down the coal mines, and that was the last of the heavy industries in the city centre. Textiles went, east, and the legacy of that was high unemployment and a lot of, social deprivation for a period in the 70s and 1980s. That led to nightlife spaces emerging where people went for sanctity, safe spaces, because when you have social deprivation, you have crime, you have violence, you have people who blame immigrants or target people in marginalized communities because of their own frustrations. So the nightlife spaces which emerged actually provided sanctity for a lot of marginalized communities in the city. And Rock Against Racism was one of the big things which, reggae and punk musicians playing together on the same bill in the late 1970s was one of the things which emerged out of that. There's a whole there's a whole body of text on the Leeds punk scene and the post-punk scene in relation to that. But what is clear today is that there is still a division between the working class youth, the people who have, who, let's say, don't go to university, don't go to college, they leave school, they get jobs, they work. They want to party hard at the weekend. They have their spaces. The students, maybe they don't work as hard as the working people do. Maybe they do, I don't know. Maybe some do, some don't. But the students have their spaces, and there is an area as well where you have mixture, but you still have distinct working class Leeds people go into some areas, you have distinct areas which are student areas, and then you have the mixture in between. So that, again, there is the class system that we have in the UK, you know, a distinction of the working class mindset to perhaps some more privileged people on another side. You know, that is still reflected today in what we see. And you can look at within the student community, you can even see where the students live, that where the richer students live are the better houses. Okay, they listen to house and electro. Where the students that can't afford those houses live, they listen to bass lines, jungle, garage, drum and bass. It's a heavier, darker reflection of what, you know, and that reflects their lives. So music is a sense of place, you know, it reflects the place that it's come from. And that is definitely reflected, particularly in the house party scene, where Headingley, you go for house parties where it's house music and electro. Hyde Park and Burley, you go for drum and bass and jungle, you know, so that is what we see.
Thank you very much. So if anyone wants to go to Leeds, I think you should definitely get in contact with Stuart. We already got a very deep and interesting introduction, but of course, nothing like experiencing it in person. So thanks again, Stuart. So now we can move on to Ben, who is joining us from LA and made an extreme effort to wake up and be present. So thanks again for that. And we will go back to London, although from a different perspective. So Ben, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just share my screen as well. Let me know if this works. Is that good?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I am maybe halfway, 2/3 of the way through my PhD, and I'm in the music department at Goldsmiths. I'm also a musician, I'm a drummer, I'm a DJ, producer, so the research I'm doing is very much rooted in my kind of life as well. And I guess my overall research started from this point of venue closures and nightclub closures in London, and rather than focusing so much on the spaces that have been lost, I kind of chose to situate my research in relation to the ways that nightlife was changing. So actually, as I kind of became interested in this whole discipline of night studies, I started thinking about the ways in which electronic dance music and nightlife was moving outside of the nighttime and moving outside of the spaces we might typically associate with the nighttime. So what I'm talking about today is kind of work in progress research of one of these case studies, which is about dance music in museums and galleries and kind of major cultural institutions in London. So I'll start here with this artwork from the artist Jeremy Deller, which is from 1995, and it's called "Do You Remember the First Time?" And basically what this piece is doing is it's imagining this exhibition on Acid House at the Tate Gallery, Liverpool in 1996. And this is a fictional event. And this came about, you know, at the height of rave culture, when it was very culturally and commercially influential in the UK. But at the same time, for this kind of exhibition to happen was kind of almost unheard of at this point. And it was, I guess, 2 decades, so 20 years or more later, that something like this would actually happen. And so in my kind of research here, what I'm talking about is a kind of short history from around 2015 to the present of when electronic music and club culture begins to be more present in gallery museum spaces in London. So here's a little list of some kind of key events and spaces and happenings during this time, which are the kind of things I'm focusing on. So today I'm just going to give a very brief overview of all of this, and the basic kind of trajectory is thinking about first museum and gallery late events, and then it's thinking about a few kind of major retrospective exhibitions on rave culture that took place around 2019, 2020. And then I'm kind of thinking about ways forward and kind of new sorts of collaborations that are happening between institutions and club culture. And I think one of the reasons I found this a really important topic is, you know, despite this list of events you can see here, it's received very little attention among scholars, but also from within kind of dance music club culture communities, I haven't really been aware of much kind of critical discussion of this stuff. And then I guess lastly, before I go on, two kind of key points to bear in the back of your mind when I'm talking about this stuff is A, you know, as Alex told us about this kind of context of club closures in London, that's really important because that's happening in parallel with all of this. And then also what I would say, this is a more kind of broader social and aesthetic point about club culture and dance music, which is the kind of importance, importance of sound, architecture, space, and kind of socialities as all coming together. And you kind of need to think together with those things to understand the significance of dance music and club culture, in my view, anyway. So to start with, museum and gallery lates, what are they? So it's this, I'm sure we're all familiar with it now. It's a very big part of many museums' cultural programming these days. And it started off as a way of just keeping a museum open later, and then it's kind of emerged into its own sort of category of event. And of course, dance music, you know, with its associations with the nighttime, this kind of thing, it became a very sort of obvious choice. So what do museum and gallery lates do? Well, for museums, longer opening hours give you more time to generate income, right? It also gives you greater opportunities to have, you know, economies based around food and beverages, etc. It also allows galleries and museums to open up to new audiences, either people that might, you know, not be able to attend during the daytime. It also creates opportunities for more diverse audiences. So at the Tate Modern in London, for example, according to some of their own statistics, their late events have brought in 150,000 new visitors, and on the nights of events, they've doubled the numbers of young audiences as well as BMAE audiences. And then I guess also by bringing in things like dance music and club culture, you know, institutions gain these associations with subcultural capital. So I've got a quote up here from Culture 24, who did a report on museum and gallery lates in 2018. And they kind of described the ways in which late events reimagine visits to museums as a leisure activity, not a learning opportunity. So that kind of ties in with this contemporary shift toward the museum as a space of entertainment. And then also we can think about museum, gallery, late events as a kind of finding of a role for museum and galleries as part of the nighttime economy, right? Just by them shifting into the nighttime, they kind of gain that association. So that's kind of what they do for museums, but then what did these events do for club culture? So for electronic music scenes, I guess, so, you know, during the time when these events were happening, which was, I guess, started around 2015, 2016, 2017, this was the moment when this big narrative of nightclub closures was really at the forefront of discussion. So late events, on the one hand, provided income for DJs. You know, when there were less spaces around, there were these quite well-funded events, and DJs I spoke to said often these kind of events would pay quite a lot better than other gigs they did. Then also, I guess it was a way in which institutions could act as an intermediary. So for example, the late events at the Tate Modern, they were organized in collaboration with NTS Radio, which is a really big online radio station in London, you know, with a huge network of associated broadcasters and DJs. But it was also sponsored by Uniqlo. And, you know, we might have different views about this kind of commingling of institutional and corporate funding, but in one sense, the institution acted as this intermediary here, right, between different kinds of public and private funding, but also this kind of insider expertise from an internal institution such as NTS Radio. So those are kind of potential benefits. But then we have this kind of social and aesthetic issue. So, you know, on the surface, there's something kind of provocative and exciting about hosting dance music in a museum. But then there's also the complexity of how do you reproduce dance music culture in a museum space? And I guess, you know, one of the most obvious things here is issue of acoustics. You know, at many late events I've attended, sound was a major struggle. So there's a kind of limitation there. And then we can also think about what's the relationship of museum late events to the wider nighttime economy in London. And so in this Culture 24 report that I discussed earlier, one of the things they kind of highlighted as a great benefit was saying how late events could diversify the nighttime economy. And there's a quote here. They suggest that late events are about turning the nighttime economy debate away from antisocial to social behavior. Now, of course, as people here with an interest in the nighttime economy, I'm sure we are all interested in this kind of debate. But I guess one of the issues is, if we're saying we need to use museums to reposition the nighttime economy as about social rather than antisocial behavior, does this kind of reproduce this narrative that nightclubs are inherently antisocial? You know, so there's a kind of complexity there. And then, as I stated at the beginning, the issue of context is also really important here, because we could, you know, in an ideal world, we could see museum late events as part of this kind of wider cultural ecology alongside nightclubs, you know, and I guess it's important to say here that although museum and gallery late events are called late events, they actually occur early in the evening. So they don't generally exist in direct competition with nightclubs. But if the context here is of club closures, then how does that change the way we understand these events? You know, so we can combat this from a place of abundance, but actually the context here is a moment of scarcity for the spaces of club culture, right? So that's the kind of some issues around the first moment of this relationship between dance music and cultural institutions. Then the second phase is these kind of big retrospective exhibitions on rave culture. So the first of these happened in 2019 at the Saatchi Gallery. Now, 2019 was a significant year because it was the 30th anniversary of the second Summer of Love in 1989. So there was actually a few things that happened at this time. There was Jeremy Deller, the artist I spoke about at the start. He had a documentary screened on the BBC. There was also Mark Leckie's Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore. That was re-screened again in the Tate Britain at this time. So there was a bit of a moment at this point. And this particular exhibition, and I'm going to quote from their own blurb, this was billed as an immersive retrospective exhibition devoted to presenting a revolutionary survey of rave culture through the voices and lenses of those who experienced it. So on this kind of broader ideological level, we can perhaps suggest that these kind of events formed the first kind of moment of institutional recognition of rave culture, you know, and as I showed at the start with Mark Leckie's artwork, that hadn't happened in the 90s, right? It took 20 years, over 20 years for this kind of thing to happen. And at this particular exhibition was kind of somewhere between a museum and gallery exhibit. So there was art, there was kind of more abstract artwork, there was also photographic documentations, but then also these kind of more immersive aspects. So there was one particular installation by this production company called Punch Drunk, who are a kind of immersive theatre company, and it was called Getting to the Rave. And it was this kind of reproduction of a petrol station that you'd go to on the way to a rave and trying to capture that moment, and it had sound effects and all this kind of thing. But interestingly, the critical response to the exhibition kind of thought that it failed to capture this experiential aspect of rave. So I've got two quotes here, one from Time Out: "Curtained off against white gallery walls, rave culture is drained of its radical spirit." And from Crack magazine: "The exhibition feels oddly removed from the experience of partying and desperately lacking in the spirit of the music it claims to document." So I guess this raises this question about how do we reproduce, or can we reproduce electronic dance music culture in a gallery? And this is not only about reproducing sound, but also this kind of full social and spatial experience. And then also, I guess we can say, well, is that a museum's job? Are they required to try and reproduce that? And that's a kind of tension. So that was the first retrospective exhibition. And the second one, a year later, was called Electronic: From Craftwork to the Chemical Brothers. And this was at the Design Museum. And this, because it's the Design Museum, it was focused much more on the role of design within dance music and club culture. So that's thinking about the design of synthesizers, but also flyers, record covers, also costumes, this kind of thing. And it had drew on this very wide archive of objects. But at the same time, it claimed that this was being achieved while, and I quote, evoking the experience of being in a club. So a really kind of key part of this exhibition was this installation right at the very last room by Adam Smith and Marcus Lyle, who are the kind of audiovisual technicians for the Chemical Brothers. And oh, sorry, 1 second, something's popped up. Sorry, yeah, this installation which kind of took the work they do with the Chemical Brothers live show and kind of shrunk it down into this small room. And so this was a really key part of this exhibition and something that I think hadn't been done before. And so interestingly, compared to the exhibition at the Saatchi Gallery, the media response to this was really positive. So as you can see here, the Evening Standard praised its sensory feast and the Guardian praised its spirit of communal celebration. And there were also some reviews in the dance music specialist press, I think Mix Mag and DJ Mag, and they were all very positive about this kind of immersive experiential aspect of the exhibition. But of course, when did this exhibition take place? It took place in 2020. So the context here is COVID lockdown. So at this particular moment, this was in late summer of 2020, nightclubs in London had been closed for some 4 or 5 months. And at this point in time, there was no like projected trajectory of when they would reopen. So we had this kind of immersive experience created in a museum, but it was the closest you could, or the closest legal approximation of a nightclub you could have in the whole city, and the closest anyone had come to experiencing that in almost half a year. So I think this was quite an interesting context. And, you know, on the one hand, I think there was something quite melancholic about it in kind of reminding you of this thing that currently didn't exist. But then at the same time, it also kind of highlighted this very basic function of the museum as a site of archiving and conservation. And then one final point I'd like to raise here is that, you know, at this moment, we had, on a symbolic level, we had this cultural recognition of club culture and rave culture in the Design Museum, which is one of the major museums in London. But at the same time, during the context of COVID, nightclubs were struggling to receive forms of state support to sustain themselves during the pandemic. So it kind of raises this issue of what's the relationship between symbolic forms of cultural recognition and more practical forms of state support and funding. So then after this phase, I'm looking at these kind of more contemporary and these forward-thinking possibilities of this relationship between dance music and club culture. So here I've got an image of Berghain in Berlin, which in 2020 was reinvented as a gallery in collaboration with Studio Berlin. So we have this kind of opposite movement of the kind of art world or an institutional world moving into the club space. And this was about kind of demonstrating that culture was still happening in Berlin during the pandemic, while also providing employment for Berghain's employees. So in terms of the press response to this, we had one journalist in the New York Times who said, perhaps art is the luxury asset that moves in when the party's over. And then another journalist in The Guardian was more optimistic and said, well, can the art world and music scene help each other navigate the choppy waters of the pandemic? And two kind of frameworks I'm thinking about as a way to think about this. Well, firstly, this idea of conceptronica that Simon Reynolds came up with in 2019, and maybe some of you have heard of this. And he was very much critical of the idea that dance music had become very reliant on kind of intellectual discourse and institutions. And he saw that as this kind of loss of authenticity from the kind of original 1990s electronic artists. I'm contrasting that with this notion of interdependence that Matt Dryhurst came up with also in 2019, which basically suggests that this idealization of artistic autonomy and artistic independence is actually no longer relevant in contemporary contexts of, precarity and austerity politics and financialization, etc. And so interdependence instead emphasizes kind of notions of collectivity. So rather than this independence of the individual artist, it's about the interdependence of this kind of networks of scenes, spaces, institutions, and media. And I think maybe, especially going into the kind of even more heightened precarity of the post-pandemic moment, I think this maybe becomes quite a useful concept moving forward. So just returning to London, a few examples of this. So this is the ICA here. And just before the pandemic, they hosted an event called Inferno, which is a kind of quite well-known queer techno and performance collective in London. And they hosted a full 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. rave event in their purpose-built theatre space. And I think what was interesting about this, as opposed to the museum and gallery late events, was the ways in which it kind of created this sort of third space. So it was on the basic level, moving rave into the gallery, but it was also exploring kind of new social and aesthetic possibilities, making the most of the kind of flexibility of the gallery space. So while we had what was ostensibly a rave, they also did things like halfway through about 2 a.m., this kind of peak time moment, they just shut the music off and had this very kind of slow performance aspect, which is something in the space of the ICA they could get away with, but somewhere in a kind of normal nightclub, they might not be able to. And just while I'm talking about this, I'm just going to raise this particular journalistic response to this event, which is actually, in the RT, the Russia Times, which is kind of, we could talk about, that's a whole other issue. But basically this journalist, I mean, it's a really awful article actually. But he kind of saw this event as this like dissent of the ICA, saying how can a space like this within spitting distance of Buckingham Palace be hosting an event where they're screening pornography in the cinemas and this kind of thing. And he said, basically part of his argument was, well, an institutional space like this shouldn't be hosting this sort of transgressive event, because there are plenty of spaces in London where that kind of thing can happen. And, there's a huge number of issues with this article, but one key thing he kind of fails to engage with here is, well, actually, there aren't that many spaces for that kind of thing in London anymore. So as we kind of enter this like heightened spatial precarity after the pandemic, it kind of suggests the kind of possible emergence of institutions as a space for these kind of events, And the last, here's a nice picture. The curator sent me this one. This is a photo of everyone after that party, and that's Buckingham Palace in the background. So ICA is just down the road from there. I think that's quite I quite like that juxtaposition there. So the last one, this is another event that took place also at the ICA. And this is a picture from Channel B, which was this was an audiovisual exploration of Black futurism by a Black-owned art, music, and creative initiative, 9 Nights, which featured artists including Gaika and Shannon SP. Now, these are examples of musicians and artists who kind of straddle the worlds of art, nightclubs, and cultural institutions. And what this event did was it had a kind of permanent exhibition, but it also had a series of events that ran alongside it. And what was interesting here is that the events took place inside the permanent exhibition space. So it kind of explored a way of bringing these two things together. And it also, for me, raises this interesting idea of, the gallery as an entertainment, so staying open late, while also being the site of critical knowledge production. So it's how can an institution use late night events as part of this wider political program, in this case, which was supporting and foregrounding contemporary Black musical culture. And then also this kind of event, very key to it is the way in which it was collaborative. So although the ICA, a big institution in London, hosted the event, they basically gave the collective 9 nights, they gave them pretty much free reign. It was like, here's the space, you do what you want with it. And I think that, that suggests something quite interesting and something that hadn't been happening before. And then I think, lastly, what this kind of event points toward, and I think a kind of possible future here, is this interdependent cultural ecology of institutions, club spaces, musicians, and artists. So it's thinking about kind of a newly sort of collaborative relationship. So not just one in which a gallery maybe tries to associate itself with the subcultural capital of dance music culture. It's this much more collaborative and interdependent relationship. And I think this is something I'm kind of very much just thinking about, but this is something I think could become, more important in the future. And just to finish, I have this one slide. So this is from an event that just took place at the London nightclub called Fold a few months ago, called Synchronous Errors. And in their blurb for the event, they say, is this an exhibition? Is this a party? Who knows? And really, who cares? And I thought that was maybe an interesting point to finish on. And I feel like I've maybe spoken for ages. So
thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
No worries. Thanks a lot. I'm sure we will still manage to introduce some of the questions we have on the chat for this presentation. But I would like to just give the floor first to Gabriela so that we can make sure that everyone gets enough time also for questions at the end. And I think Gabriela's presentation is the perfect continuation of this discussion we just heard, since her project is precisely trying to do the opposite of what Saatchi Gallery did by trying to show an exhibition at a museum, but it's actually a photo documentary of the raving scene from a properly insider look. So I'd like to welcome Gabriela to present her part. Oh, your sound is a little bit off for some reason. I don't know if you can switch off and on your mic again. We can hear some weird noise. Maybe try plugging in some headphones. Gabriela, can you try to log out and in of Zoom again? It was fine, your sound, when we started the call. Okay, so maybe we can jump into a question while we wait for Gabriela to be back. And I would start by Alessia, who wants to ask if, do you think the institutionalization of nightlife practices should be held, or if that might hamper the distinct character of the night, since informality is a really important aspect of nightlife?
Yeah, definitely. And of course, that's one of the really key sort of theoretical discussions to this research. One of the things, so I spoke about those last two events at the ICI. I spoke about them with one of the main curators, and I asked them about this stuff and about, I asked them, do you think this kind of institutional money would be better spent given directly to nightlife spaces, right? Cutting out this kind of middleman of the institution. And actually what Sarah said to me was, well, actually as an institution, there's a lot of, there's a lot of boxes you have to tick when you receive public funding. There's lots of things you have to prove you can do. So they said to me, they thought that having this money directed toward these kind of events was actually better because it would allow clubs to kind of retain their freedom. And so that, I think this is a really interesting point, and this is where I kind of think this kind of idea of that, I don't like the term, but this kind of third space that exists somewhere in between institutions and the real nightlife spaces is potentially interesting as, kind of one way in which these scenes and communities can receive money without having to fundamentally change what they do. And one thing I didn't mention actually, but I'm sure we're all aware, Berghain, received this change of status in which it's grouped together with concert halls and opera houses and all this kind of thing. And that's obviously really great in so many ways. But I think one of the things that a lot of people don't mention is that part of that was also dependent on Berghain setting up these new kinds of cultural programming, which are much more focused on kind of experimental avant-garde musics as a way of kind of justifying themselves in receiving this kind of funding, right? And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but that there's definitely that that kind of repositioning of themselves. So yeah, I think this is a really, really important issue for sure.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. There's more questions and also a mention by Stuart in the chat. He's still here, but yeah, it might be useful for you if you need the contact of the ICA director.
Yeah, great.
Now Gabrielle is back, and I think the sound is back as well. At least it sounds good.
Hi, is it better or?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yes, fine. So, and can you hear my screen or not?
We cannot see it yet. You need to use the share screen function. I believe we made you a co-moderator.
But I used, but I don't. Still not.
Have you used the share screen button in the middle?
Yeah, but in the middle, I don't have a share screen, but share screen button. Just something like live transcription. It's something. I don't know.
You sent me your presentation, so I can try to share my screen instead.
Okay, thank you.
If you don't find it in the meantime. So. Apologies for this little hiccup. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see.
Perfect.
So hello, I'm sorry I don't have a good English level, so I will read my presentation for better understanding. I would like to thank the organizers for being able to present the latest project, a book about the Prague warehouse raves, location TBA. At the same time, I would like to present my second book, Padáme i na tvou hlavu. It's in English, Falling in Your Head. which was also published at the end of the last year and shows various places in alternative culture in Prague in the 90s. I process my documentary projects mostly as an actor in the environment where I move, not as a mere observer. Through excerpts from my photographic projects as well as shots of other authors, I want to show places and activities that were related to both of these books. None of these places exist today, and the Prague scene is poorer and less diverse without them. Please, the second slide, Miguel. Thank you. In the second half of the 90s, as a photographer, I participated in creating the content of the ecological magazine Alternativa. Its editor-in-chief and my friend lived in one of Prague's squad, Umedáku, in Střešovice district. The squad functioned as a space for ecology, fine arts, music, and civic activities. I participated occasionally in his program and also photographed there for several years. The squad was liquidated in 2003. The collection of photographs from the squad Umedáku forms one of the chapters of the book about Prague Center squads and clubs, which today no longer exist, except for one, and that is the now 50-year-old legend Club 007 in Strahov. Okay, please, next slide. Yes, here is Bajkazil. In 2010, my then partner Martin and I founded a center to promote non-motorized transport and sustainable lifestyle, Bajkazil. Over the years, several branches have been opened in Prague and in major Czech cities. The largest place was on Prague's embankment, where for 7 years many concerts, theaters for adults and children, site-specific dance, new circus, and other events of related organizations and entities were held in the open air in a public space by the river. Unfortunately, the Prague places couldn't be maintained when the usual pretext for their closure was too much noise, and on the embankment then also its gentrification. And please, next. Thank you. Here is FAMU Club. In 2015, I built and opened a club in the basement of FAMU as a space for various cultural activities and a meeting place. It operated for 2 years, and there were a large number of concerts, parties, theater performances, and festivals of all kinds. At that time, I also started working with the organizers of the Polygon Rave Party and began to create a set of photographs that became the basis for the book Location TBA. Club logo and visual materials was designed by Michal Veltruský, member of Nightlife, Rave Collective, and later also graphic designer of the book Location TBA. And then please, now please the last slide. Yes, Location TBA is the book, and in 2017, the FAMU Club first ended as the new management didn't want to have any noise and wanted more money for the cellar space. In the autumn, we had to vacate Bajkazil on the embankment, where we never returned. The embankment administration banned all cultural activities, had the premises reconstructed according to a uniform design and pushed all diversity out of this gentrified zone. At the same time, the first wave of the large rave parties ended and their organizers began to devote themselves to the other projects. Many of the buildings where we all experienced warehouse raves between 2015 and 2017 were rebuilt or don't exist now. At the time, it was the right time to inspect the photographic archive and process book about the extinct places to Prague culture. So that's all from me, and thank you for listening.